Somewhere on Earth, right now, the price of bread is quietly tied to the width of a strait most people couldn't point to on a map. Global food doesn't move like most other goods. It funnels through a small handful of narrow maritime choke points, and by some estimates, roughly 80% of the world's traded grain, fertilizer, and agricultural cargo passes through just 5 of them. When one of those choke points closes, even temporarily, the effects don't stay local. In February 2022, a regional war thousands of miles from most bakeries sent wheat prices spiking within days, hitting countries on entirely different continents. Egypt, one of the largest wheat importers on Earth, felt it almost immediately. So did bakeries in Lebanon, food programs in East Africa, and grocery bills in countries that had nothing to do with the conflict itself. None of that happened because the world suddenly had less food. It happened because the world's food supply depends on a handful of narrow gaps in the map staying open. The stakes are almost impossible to overstate. Billions of people rely, often without realizing it, on ships successfully threading a few specific, vulnerable channels of water. So how did feeding much of the world come to depend on 5 narrow points on a map? And what actually happens when one of them breaks? Start with a basic fact about global agriculture. Food production is not evenly distributed across the planet. A relatively small number of regions, the American Midwest, the Black Sea region, and parts of South America, produce enormous surpluses of grain. A much larger number of countries, especially across the Middle East and North Africa, cannot grow nearly enough food to feed their own populations. That imbalance means grain has to travel enormous distances by sea, and sea routes inevitably funnel through a small number of physical bottlenecks. The first, and arguably most consequential of these 5 choke points, is the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, together known as the Turkish Straits. These narrow waterways connect the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, and they are the only sea route in or out of the Black Sea entirely. Access through them has been governed since 1936 by an international agreement called the Montreux Convention, which gives Turkey authority over passage through the straits. Before 2022, Ukraine and Russia combined supplied roughly a quarter to a third of the entire world's traded wheat. Virtually all of that grain leaves by sea, through Black Sea ports, and every single ton has to pass through the Turkish Straits to reach international markets. There is no alternative sea route out of the Black Sea. Geography simply doesn't offer one. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Ukrainian Black Sea ports were blockaded, and shipping routes became a war zone almost overnight. Global wheat futures spiked by more than 50% within weeks, one of the sharpest short-term moves in the grain market's modern history. Countries with little direct connection to the war absorbed the shock hardest. Egypt alone had historically sourced well over half its wheat imports from Russia and Ukraine combined. In July 2022, the United Nations and Turkey brokered an agreement known as the Black Sea Grain Initiative, creating a monitored corridor to let Ukrainian grain ships pass safely. It partially restored exports for about a year before Russia withdrew from the agreement in July 2023, reintroducing uncertainty into the same narrow channel. That single sequence of events shows exactly how the whole system works. A regional conflict, a narrow strait, and a bread price spike on a different continent, all connected by one physical choke point. The second major choke point is the Suez Canal, connecting the Mediterranean directly to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean beyond. For grain moving from the Black Sea or Europe toward Asia, Suez is often the only realistic route that doesn't add weeks of extra sailing time around Africa. In March 2021, the container ship Ever Given ran aground and blocked the canal entirely for 6 days, delaying an enormous volume of cargo, grain shipments included. That incident was mechanical rather than political, but the underlying vulnerability was identical. A single physical failure point that the entire route has no way around. The third choke point sits on the opposite side of the world, the Panama Canal, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. A substantial share of the canal's total cargo, commonly estimated at around 30% by volume, is agricultural: corn, soybeans, and wheat, moving from U.S. Gulf Coast ports toward Asia. That route has its own well-documented fragility. A severe drought in 2023 forced Panama's Canal Authority to sharply cut daily ship transits, driving up shipping costs and delaying grain deliveries for months. The fourth choke point is the Strait of Malacca, the narrow passage between Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. It's the primary route connecting Indian Ocean shipping lanes to East Asia, carrying rice and wheat imports into some of the most densely populated countries on Earth, alongside palm oil exports moving the other direction. Malaysia and Indonesia together produce the overwhelming majority of the world's palm oil, one of the most widely used cooking oils and food ingredients globally, and virtually all of it ships out through this single strait. The fifth choke point works a little differently, because it isn't primarily about grain moving directly. It's about the inputs that make modern industrial agriculture possible at all. The Strait of Hormuz, between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, carries roughly a fifth of the world's oil. But it also carries a huge share of the natural gas used to manufacture nitrogen fertilizer. Qatar alone is one of the largest exporters of ammonia and urea, the raw materials behind synthetic fertilizer, and virtually all of it leaves through Hormuz. Modern industrial farming depends heavily on synthetic fertilizer to achieve the yields that feed billions of people. Disrupt fertilizer supply chains, and crop yields fall the following season, not immediately, but just as certainly. Put these 5 choke points together, the Turkish Straits, Suez, Panama, Malacca, and Hormuz, and you're looking at the physical bottleneck for most of the world's traded grain, edible oils, and the fertilizer inputs that grow the next harvest. That's the basis for the 80% estimate, not a single official government statistic, but a rough aggregate across trade data covering grain, fertilizer, and key agricultural inputs, moving through exactly these 5 points. It's worth asking why the world hasn't simply built redundancy into this system. Part of the answer is pure economics. Shipping by sea is dramatically cheaper per ton than any land-based alternative, especially over the distances involved in international grain trade. Rail networks exist, but they were never built with the capacity to substitute for tens of millions of tons of seaborne grain on short notice. Part of the answer is also simple geography. Some of these bottlenecks, like the Turkish Straits or the Strait of Malacca, have no viable sea-based alternative route at all. You either sail through the narrow gap that exists, or you don't reach the ocean beyond it. This is exactly what makes global food markets so sensitive to disruptions that, on paper, look purely regional. Grain, unlike many other commodities, trades on tightly integrated global futures markets, where prices respond within hours to supply shocks anywhere in the system. A blockade in the Black Sea doesn't just affect buyers who normally purchase Ukrainian wheat directly. It pushes buyers who lost access to that supply into competing for wheat from other exporting regions, like the United States or Australia, driving up prices across the entire global market simultaneously. That's why a war in the Black Sea can raise bread prices in a country that never imported a single ton of Ukrainian wheat directly. The pain from these disruptions is never distributed evenly. Wealthier, food-secure countries can typically absorb a price spike by paying more, or by drawing on larger strategic reserves. Countries that already spend a large share of household income on food, and that depend heavily on imports rather than domestic production, get hit hardest and fastest. Egypt, Lebanon, Yemen, and several other countries across the Middle East and North Africa fall squarely into that second category. There's a documented historical link between sharp global food price spikes and political instability. Researchers have pointed to rising bread and grain prices as one contributing factor behind the wave of unrest that spread across parts of the Middle East and North Africa starting in 2010 and 2011. That doesn't mean food prices alone caused those events. The underlying political and economic grievances were deep and complex. But food price shocks clearly acted as an accelerant, turning existing tension into open unrest faster than it might have otherwise developed. That history is precisely why governments and international institutions treat these 5 choke points as strategic concerns, not just logistics problems. A closed strait isn't simply a shipping inconvenience. In the right conditions, it can become a driver of real political instability, far from the choke point itself. Some countries have tried to reduce their exposure to this fragility directly. Egypt has spent years trying to expand domestic wheat production and diversify its import sources beyond the Black Sea region, with only partial success. Several countries maintain strategic grain reserves, specifically designed to buffer against short-term supply shocks, though most reserves are sized for weeks or months, not sustained years-long disruptions. Some grain traders and governments have also explored alternative routes and suppliers, diversifying purchases across more countries so that no single choke point disruption threatens the entire supply at once. None of these strategies eliminate the underlying geographic dependency. They just spread the risk slightly thinner across a system that's still fundamentally reliant on the same 5 narrow points. Climate change adds another layer of pressure to a system already stretched thin. The Panama Canal's 2023 drought crisis was a preview of exactly this kind of risk, a choke point failing not because of war or politics, but because of rainfall patterns nobody can fully control. As droughts, heat waves, and shifting weather patterns become more frequent in key growing regions and along key shipping corridors, the reliability of this entire 5-point system faces pressure from a direction most food security planning wasn't originally built to address. Zooming out, there's something genuinely strange about how modern food security actually works. It's easy to assume global hunger and food insecurity are primarily about how much food exists in the world. In raw terms, global food production is usually more than sufficient to feed the world's population. The deeper, more fragile issue is whether that food can reliably move from where it's grown to where it's needed. And that movement depends overwhelmingly on a small number of narrow, physically vulnerable points that nobody can simply build more of. You can't widen the Bosphorus, and you can't relocate the Strait of Malacca. These choke points exist exactly where geography placed them, and the entire global food system has been built to depend on all of them staying open all the time. For the average person buying bread, cooking oil, or a bag of rice, none of this is visible in any obvious way. Prices simply rise or fall at the grocery store, disconnected from any obvious cause. But trace that price back far enough, and it very often leads to one of 5 narrow gaps in the map. A strait controlled by international treaty since 1936, a canal that can run short of rainwater, or a passage between 2 countries most shoppers have never visited. That's the quiet, unsettling truth underneath global food security. It was never really about how much grain the world can grow. It's about whether a handful of narrow waterways, built by geology rather than policy, can keep functioning exactly the way billions of people have come to depend on, every single day, without exception.